Why did everyone seem so loud that afternoon, except her? Sarah Martinez sat alone at the corner table of the base cafeteria, her gray eyes fixed somewhere beyond the chatter and the smell of reheated rations. The metallic hum of trays and boots filled the air, familiar, ordinary, almost comforting. She liked these moments of normality, moments when she could pretend she was just another uniform, another body in motion, not the ghost she really was. 28 years old, too young to feel that old. She chewed her sandwich slowly, the way someone eats when their mind is elsewhere, somewhere darker, quieter. No one here knew what she'd done or where she'd been. Her file said liaison officer, a neat phrase that hid the truth behind layers of classified ink. She was here for a reason, of course, a temporary assignment to observe and advise personnel on surveillance procedures. Nothing unusual, nothing that would draw attention. But Sarah knew the problem with blending in. You became invisible even to those who should have seen you. The cafeteria buzzed with laughter and talk about weekend plans. Around her, soldiers shared jokes, bragged about field scores, or complained about the new chain of command. Sarah listened without listening. She preferred it this way, silence inside, noise outside. The balance kept her sane. Then she noticed them. 4 men, early 20s maybe, still carrying that restless confidence soldiers get after their first combat tour, the kind that often dies fast or gets someone hurt. They wore patches of the 82nd Airborne, shoulder muscles tight, steps in sync, like they'd practiced this kind of entrance before. The tallest, a sergeant with a scar slicing down his left cheek, led the pack. Morrison, his name tag said. He had that smirk, the kind that came before trouble. Behind him, 3 others fanned out in casual formation, their eyes scanning her corner table like wolves circling an easy target. Nah, what do we have here? Morrison's voice cut through the chatter. Heads turned. Conversation slowed. Looks like a lost little sailor girl wandered into the wrong part of town. A few laughs followed, sharp, nervous, eager. Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. She just took another slow bite of her sandwich. Her training had taught her that silence could do more damage than any punch. It made people fill the void with their own fear. But Morrison took her calm for weakness. "You hear me," he said louder, tapping the table with a heavy finger. "This area's for real soldiers. Maybe you want to find a different seat." His friend Jackson leaned on the edge of her table, invading the space most people guard without thinking. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, his grin spreading. "This place ain't for tourists." The room shifted. Conversations faded. Some soldiers watched from the corners of their eyes, waiting to see what would happen. No one intervened. That's how it often went. No one wanted trouble until it was already too late. Sarah laid her sandwich down with care. The movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. Then she looked up at Morrison, not defiant, not afraid, just present. "I'm having lunch," she said softly. That was all, but something in her tone, calm, layered, unblinking, carried a depth they didn't understand. Morrison's grin widened. "Oh, she's got some fight in her, huh, boys?" He nodded, and the circle around her tightened. Rodriguez crossed his arms, his stance wide, trying to look relaxed. Williams, the youngest, laughed nervously, then reached toward her shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't make it hard," he said, that mocking tone soldiers use when they're showing off in front of each other. She could have warned him one more time, could have told him that his next breath would taste different, but she didn't. When his hand moved closer, something inside her clicked, a quiet mechanical shift. Her pulse slowed, her senses sharpened. The cafeteria noise dulled into a distant hum. Training took over. The moment his fingers brushed her uniform, she moved. What happened next lasted 45 seconds, but no one in that cafeteria would ever forget it. Her left hand caught his wrist, a grip so precise it triggered the nerve cluster between his radius and ulna. His face twisted before he even understood why. Pain shot up his arm, his knees buckled. She stood smoothly, using his momentum, twisting, pivoting. Williams stumbled forward, trapped in her leverage point, his shoulder locked in a joint-breaking angle that froze him in place. Morrison reacted next, lunging to grab her arm. Too slow. She rotated just enough to convert his strength into imbalance. His size worked against him. His boots scraped across the tile. Before he could blink, he was off balance, his center of gravity stolen from under him. Rodriguez cursed and stepped in. Jackson tried to circle around her back. She registered every motion, distances, angles, breath rhythm, all in one glance. Jackson lunged, trying to lock his arms around her torso. Bad move. She dipped her center, twisted her hips, and redirected his force. He slammed into the table behind her, sending trays and silverware clattering to the floor. Gasps rippled through the cafeteria, chairs scraped. Rodriguez hesitated. He'd seen enough to know something wasn't right, but pride's a dangerous thing in a soldier. It makes you double down when you should walk away. He charged. She pivoted left, her movement a blur of precision. He missed her entirely, momentum carrying him forward. She sidestepped, a motion so graceful it almost looked rehearsed. The matador move, her instructors had called it. By the time he caught his footing, she'd already repositioned, controlled, centered, unshaken. 15 seconds, 4 trained men already disoriented. Morrison recovered first. He swung hard, a boxer's right hook, the kind meant to end fights, but she'd already read his intent before his shoulder even rolled. She pulled Williams into his line of fire. His punch connected, just not with her. The impact drove into Williams's shoulder with a sickening thud. Williams cried out, staggered, clutching his arm. Morrison froze, stunned by his own mistake. She didn't. Her counterstrike came clean, controlled, a quick thrust straight to his solar plexus. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't loud, but Morrison's breath vanished. His body folded like steel under pressure. Jackson came again, desperate, wild. She felt the shift in air behind her, dropped low, and drove an elbow back into his gut. The air left him in a single, hollow sound. His grip failed. A chair crashed. Someone shouted, "Hey, what's going on?" But no one dared step closer. 30 seconds. Rodriguez lunged again. She turned, lifted her knee, caught him mid-chest. The force was enough to stop him cold. He stumbled backward, hit the floor, staring up at the fluorescent lights. The cafeteria had gone silent, except for the sound of boots scraping, of soldiers gasping, of disbelief settling in. 35 seconds. Morrison was on his knees, gasping. Jackson was tangled with an overturned chair. Williams cradled his hand, numb and trembling. Rodriguez lay stunned on the ground. Sarah stood in the center of the chaos, calm, steady, her breathing measured. She looked like someone who had just finished adjusting a clock. 40 seconds. She made one slow step forward, not threatening, not aggressive, just decisive. Every man instinctively backed away. Then her voice, quiet but absolute. "Gentlemen, this confrontation is over. You will return to your seats. You will eat your lunch, and we will not speak again." No anger, no ego, just command, the kind that comes from someone who's led men into fire and brought them home. Morrison straightened slowly. His eyes flicked from her to the ground. He nodded once. Williams stepped back. Jackson froze, unsure. Rodriguez pushed himself up, his face pale, confusion clouding whatever bravado he'd had. 45 seconds. Sarah picked up her sandwich, sat back down, took a calm bite as if nothing had happened. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then whispers spread, soft and stunned. No one could process what they'd seen: 4 soldiers, beaten not by force but by precision, composure, and something colder: control. When Morrison finally turned to leave, the others followed, quiet, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding hers. The same soldiers who had arrived like predators now exited like men who had looked into a mirror and seen prey. Sarah chewed once more, eyes steady on her tray. To anyone watching, she was the same woman who'd sat down 20 minutes ago, but inside her mind hadn't relaxed. Not yet. She learned long ago that after every fight comes the echo, the scanning for unseen threats, the readiness that never switches off. She felt the eyes on her, dozens of them, the whispers, the questions that would come. She kept her cover intact for years, and in less than a minute it had cracked. She knew what this meant. By nightfall, the story would spread across the base. 4 airborne soldiers dropped by one quiet woman, and someone up the chain would start asking questions. Questions that might reach files not meant to be opened. Still, she didn't regret it. She'd given them chances. They crossed a line. She had done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. As the adrenaline faded, she breathed in the sterile cafeteria air and thought, 45 seconds. That's all it takes to reveal who someone truly is. Outside, sunlight spilled over the tarmac, indifferent to what had just happened. Inside, Sarah Martinez, the woman no one really knew, finished her lunch in silence. Why did the cafeteria feel colder when she stood to leave? Maybe it was the way people looked at her now, not with open mockery but with a kind of careful distance. Respect mixed with fear. She'd seen that look before, in interrogation rooms, on battlefields, in mirrors. Sarah gathered her tray quietly, dropped it in the return slot, and walked out without glancing back. Every step echoed down the corridor, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. 45 seconds of exposure. That's all it took to undo months of careful anonymity. By the time she reached her quarters, the whispers had already spread. You could feel rumor move through a base like wind through dry grass, fast, invisible, unstoppable. The woman from the cafeteria took out 4 guys, didn't even break a sweat. Some said she'd used a knife. Others said she'd broken bones. The story grew teeth before the truth could catch up. Inside her small room, Sarah removed her cap and sat on the edge of the bunk. The air smelled of detergent and metal, the scent of every military space she'd ever lived in. She rubbed her wrist where Williams had almost touched her, not because it hurt, but because it lingered, a trace of adrenaline that refused to leave her bloodstream. You handled it cleanly, she told herself. Minimal force, no injuries, but she knew better. Violence, even controlled, always left a shadow. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. "Ma'am," a voice said from the hallway, low but formal. "Master Sergeant Thompson, Major Chen requests your presence." She expected that. Military procedure didn't leave room for mysteries, not when there were witnesses. "Understood," she answered, standing smoothly, fixing her uniform with practiced precision. As she followed Thompson across the base, she noticed how soldiers stepped aside in the corridor, pretending not to look. Respect, curiosity, unease, it was all there, written on their faces. Thompson walked in silence, but his shoulders were tight. When they reached the administration wing, he stopped at a steel door. "Major Chen's office," he said, then added more quietly, "She's fair. Just tell her the truth." The truth? Sarah almost smiled. In her world, truth came in classified layers. Major Rebecca Chen's office looked like any other polished desk, framed commendations, an American flag hanging behind her chair. But Sarah's trained eyes caught the details. The white noise generator humming faintly, the thicker door seals, the secure file cabinet marked with red tape. A room built for private conversations. "Lieutenant Martinez," Chen said, rising to greet her. The major was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, every gesture measured. "Please have a seat." Sarah obeyed, posture straight, expression unreadable. Chen didn't waste time. "I've received multiple incident reports about a confrontation in the cafeteria this afternoon." Her voice was calm, not accusatory. "I'd like to hear your version." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah folded her hands. 4 soldiers approached me during my meal. Their behavior became verbally aggressive. One attempted physical contact. I neutralized the threat using the minimal force necessary. No permanent injuries reported. Chen studied her face for several seconds. That's a very precise summary. I'm trained to be concise, ma'am. I can see that. Chen leaned back slightly. Their statements match yours mostly. What doesn't match is the level of skill described. The witnesses say you moved like someone who's done this before, many times. Silence stretched between them. Sarah met her gaze without blinking. I've received advanced defensive tactics training appropriate to my duties. Appropriate to a liaison officer. Another silence. A clock ticked on the wall. Finally, Chen sighed softly and opened a secure file on her computer. The blue glow reflected in her eyes as she scrolled. Your personnel file is unusually thin. No deployment history, no disciplinary record, no commendations, nothing beyond surface-level data. That usually means one of two things: incompetence or classification. Sarah said nothing. Chen's fingers paused on the keyboard. I've just read a restricted memo attached to your record. It confirms my suspicion. You're not just an instructor, are you? The question wasn't really a question. Sarah kept her voice even. My current assignment falls under Section 12, Covert Evaluation of Base Readiness and Personnel Conduct. Specific details are compartmentalized. That was all she could say, without breaching operational protocol. Chen nodded slowly. She'd seen officers like Sarah before, ghosts with clearance levels that outranked explanation. I understand, she said finally. That explains a lot. Still, we have a problem. Sarah waited. Your cover, Chen continued. It's gone. By tomorrow morning, everyone on this base will know what happened. Rumor spreads faster than regulation, and perception becomes reality. You can't exactly run covert assessments when half the staff thinks you're some kind of legend. Sarah exhaled quietly. Agreed, ma'am. So, Chen said, folding her hands, what do you propose? That surprised her. Most commanding officers would simply reassign or silence. Chen was different, curious, pragmatic. I believe, Sarah began carefully, the incident can still serve operational value. The soldiers' reaction and the bystanders' inaction reveal gaps in threat assessment and escalation control. Those patterns can inform your readiness metrics. Chen tilted her head. You're saying this accident can become a test? Yes, ma'am. A live data evaluation of the base's security culture. The event itself already exposed behavioral weaknesses: hesitation, assumption, groupthink. Chen thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. That's exactly the kind of analysis they teach in Black Ops command courses. Fine, we adapt. She tapped a note on her console. We'll treat today as phase 0 of your assessment, but Lieutenant, understand this, you're under a microscope now. Any further confrontation, even verbal, and I'll have to report it up the chain. Understood, ma'am. Good, Chen's tone softened. For what it's worth, I read between the lines of that classified file. You've been through a lot of fires. I don't need details, just don't burn this place down. Sarah almost smiled, the first trace of warmth in her voice all day. That's never my intention, ma'am. When she left the office, dusk had settled outside. The base looked peaceful, rows of barracks, hum of generators, a helicopter gliding like a shadow against a purple sky. But peace on a military base was always an illusion. Beneath the order lived tension, egos, trauma, pride, fear. She'd just torn the veil off all of it. That night she couldn't sleep. The events replayed in fragments, faces, voices, the moment Morrison's fist froze midair. She acted on instinct, not anger, but still the memory weighed on her. She wasn't proud of humiliating them. She'd seen men break from smaller blows. Pride was fragile, and humiliation had a long echo. She stared at the ceiling until the first hint of dawn crept through the blinds. Somewhere outside, a truck started, a whistle blew, and another day began, routine, ordered, indifferent. By mid-morning, the cafeteria buzzed again. She walked in as if nothing had changed, carrying her tray, same sandwich, same seat. The noise dipped when she entered. Then it returned, but softer, cautious. She ate quietly, feeling every stare. A few soldiers nodded respectfully. Others looked away, embarrassed, unsure what to make of her. Morrison and his team were nowhere to be seen. Then she saw him, Master Sergeant Thompson, again, approaching with that half-respectful, half-uneasy gait. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "Major Chen asked me to deliver this." He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a short note. Directive: continue assessment in modified capacity. Observe morale, discipline, and rumor response dynamics. Report findings confidentially. So it was official. The incident had become her mission. Over the next few days, Sarah moved through the base like a silent observer. She noticed how people whispered when she passed, how stories mutated, how fear disguised itself as admiration, and how easily confidence could flip into self-doubt. She saw Morrison once across the gym. He was alone, lifting weights, jaw tight, eyes avoiding hers. His arm moved stiffly, he was still sore. But what struck her wasn't the physical bruise. It was the way he carried himself, slower, quieter, humbled. Later, she overheard Jackson in the hallway telling a younger recruit, "Don't underestimate anyone, ever." The tone wasn't angry. It was lesson learned. That's when she realized something had shifted. The fight hadn't just exposed arrogance, it had started to heal it. But not everyone saw it that way. Some officers whispered that discipline was slipping. Others feared that if word reached the press, the base's reputation would suffer. Military pride was a delicate machine. It didn't tolerate cracks. One afternoon, Chen called her back. "The colonel's aware now," she said, tone neutral. "He's not angry, just curious. Wants to meet you before we decide next steps." Sarah nodded. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 900 hours." As Sarah left the office, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. For the first time since the cafeteria, she saw fatigue around her eyes. Not from the fight, from what came after. The scrutiny. The isolation. She whispered to herself, 45 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. Outside, a storm was forming over the desert horizon. Dark clouds rolled like bruises, lightning flaring in distant silence. She watched it for a moment, then turned back toward the barracks. Inside her chest, calm and conflict coexisted, that uneasy mix of duty and humanity that defined her whole career. She didn't regret what she'd done, but she knew this was far from over. Somewhere between the hum of the generators and the whisper of the wind, Sarah understood what this new mission truly was, not about surveillance, not about readiness reports. It was about perception, about proving that strength wasn't measured in muscle or medals, but in control. And as the first drops of rain hit the ground, she thought, sometimes survival isn't about winning the fight. It's about what you teach after it's over. What do you say to a man who can end your mission with a single word? Sarah stood outside the command office at 08:59. She'd been on bases like this her whole life, sterile hallways, portraits of decorated officers, the faint smell of polish and old paper. But this time she wasn't here as an observer. She was the subject, the anomaly, the rumor made flesh. The door opened. "Lieutenant Martinez," a young aide said, "Colonel Williams will see you now." She stepped inside. Colonel Patricia Williams sat behind a broad desk, a coffee mug in her hand, the kind of calm authority that came from decades of leading people through storms. Her gray uniform was crisp, her eyes sharper than the medals on her chest. "Lieutenant," the colonel began. Her voice wasn't cold, it was measured, the tone of someone who'd already read every report but wanted to hear the truth from the source. "Please sit." Sarah took the seat across from her. "I've reviewed the statements," Williams said, flipping through a folder. 4 soldiers, 1 unarmed confrontation, no serious injuries, no property damage. And yet, half this base is whispering about it like it was a combat operation. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "Do you realize what that means? what 45 seconds of action did to this installation. I do, ma'am. Then explain it to me. Sarah met her gaze. Perception, ma'am. They saw something they weren't prepared to see, a woman they underestimated, and what followed challenged their understanding of control, discipline, and hierarchy. The colonel studied her. You talk like a psychologist. Sarah allowed a faint smile. I was trained to think like one. It's how you survive when bullets aren't the only weapon. Williams closed the file slowly. Major Chen briefed me on your actual assignment. I know you were placed here under Section 12 authority. I won't pretend I like being kept in the dark, but I understand the need for certain layers of secrecy. Thank you, ma'am. What I don't understand, the colonel continued, is why you let it go that far. You could have disengaged, walked away. Instead, you dismantled 4 soldiers in front of 50 witnesses. Why? Sarah hesitated. The answer wasn't simple. I tried to avoid escalation, she said. But when one of them reached for me, it wasn't about ego or pride. It was instinct. You don't turn that off. Not when you've spent years surviving on reaction timing. The moment contact was initiated, I was operating under reflex, not aggression. Williams leaned back in her chair, tapping the mug. So it wasn't anger. No, ma'am, it was preservation. The colonel nodded slightly. I believe you, and I'll be honest, part of me is impressed, but another part worries. Because the moment those 4 hit the floor, you stopped being invisible. You became a story. Sarah said nothing. Do you know what happens to stories in the military? Williams asked quietly. They grow teeth. They spread faster than orders, and they shape morale more than memos ever could. Sarah's silence was her answer. The colonel sighed, her tone softening. You didn't choose that, but now you have to manage it. You've become a symbol whether you wanted to or not. Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd spent years hiding behind anonymity. The thought of being a symbol made her uneasy. Symbols attract attention, and attention gets people killed. Williams closed the folder, pushed it aside, and looked at her with something almost like respect. I don't want to remove you from this base. In fact, I think this situation might do more good than harm if we're careful. You've already exposed cultural blind spots in my ranks. Maybe that's worth exploring. Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly. You want to use this? I want to learn from it, Williams corrected. Major Chen mentioned your insights about readiness and observation. I'd like you to conduct a deeper analysis. Morale, chain of command response, perception of authority. Think of it as a live field psychology report. Use what happened as a lens. That surprised her. Commanders rarely turned embarrassment into opportunity. I can do that, Sarah said quietly. Good, you'll report directly to Major Chen, but I'll review your conclusions personally. Williams leaned forward, tone firm. And Lieutenant, I read your restricted file. I know who you are, or at least who you used to be. I served with SEALs once. I know what kind of ghosts come back from that world. Sarah froze. The colonel's words hit something she'd buried deep. Ma'am. Williams raised a hand gently. Relax. Your secret's safe. But I'll tell you this, whatever happened in your past, don't let it define how this mission ends. Sometimes redemption doesn't come from saving others. It comes from teaching them to see differently. Sarah looked down for a moment, then nodded. Understood, ma'am. When she left the office, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. Not peace, not forgiveness, but direction. The colonel had given her purpose again. Over the next week, Sarah watched the base change in subtle ways. Morrison and his team, the 4 who had surrounded her, walked quieter now. Not ashamed, just thoughtful. She noticed them training harder, volunteering for drills, sitting closer together at meals as if protecting each other from the memory. She saw Jackson in the gym coaching a younger recruit on de-escalation techniques. Rodriguez signed up for extra defensive tactics sessions. Even Williams, the one whose wrist she'd twisted, sent her a quiet nod across the hall one morning, not apology, but acknowledgement. People began treating her differently too. Respectfully, yes, but also cautiously, as if she were a storm that might return. That distance stung more than she expected. She hadn't wanted to be feared. Still, she did her job. She met with small groups, observed drills, analyzed reports, documented how rumor evolved. What began as gossip had transformed into something closer to legend. The SEAL who doesn't blink. The ghost in uniform. She hated it, but she understood it too. Myths are easier to follow than people. One night, as she worked alone in her quarters, she opened the secure terminal and began drafting her assessment. Her notes were clinical at first. Incident impact. Morale destabilized, later rebalanced. Observation. Incident increased awareness of gender bias within chain of command. Recommendation. Revise escalation protocols, integrate adaptive threat recognition training. Then she paused. Her hands hovered above the keyboard. She added something personal, a line that wasn't regulation approved. Strength isn't measured by dominance, but by discipline under pressure. She stared at the sentence for a while, then saved the file. The next day, Major Chen called her in again. "I've been reviewing your progress," she said. "You've already gathered valuable data." The colonel's pleased. "I'm glad, ma'am. But there's something else." Chen's tone shifted. "The men you fought, they've requested to speak with you, privately." Sarah blinked. "All four?" "Yes, together." "Purpose?" "They didn't specify, but if I had to guess, maybe they're trying to understand, or maybe they just need closure." Sarah exhaled slowly. "When?" "This afternoon, Training Hall 3. She nodded. When she arrived, the room was mostly empty except for the mats rolled out for drills. The four men stood in a loose line, Morrison in front, his scar catching the light, the others behind him. Their expressions weren't defensive, just human. "Lieutenant," Morrison said, voice steady, "thank you for coming." Sarah gave a small nod. "I'm listening." He shifted slightly. "We wanted to say we were out of line, all of us. That day in the cafeteria, it wasn't about you. It was about us trying to prove something. We thought toughness meant noise. You showed us something else." Rodriguez added quietly, "We embarrassed the uniform. You didn't." Sarah looked at them for a long moment. She'd expected resentment, not humility. "It's easy to underestimate what we don't understand," she said softly. "You reacted the way you were taught, dominance over doubt. But real discipline means recognizing danger before it's visible. You weren't the first to learn that the hard way." Williams spoke next, his hand still bandaged. "If you don't mind, ma'am, we'd like to train with you. Learn what you know, not the secrets, just the mindset." Sarah hesitated. She'd avoided teaching close combat since her last classified operation, the one that had gone wrong, but something about their sincerity felt genuine. She nodded once. "Tomorrow 600, bring discipline, leave ego outside." Morrison smiled faintly. "Yes, ma'am." As they left, Sarah stayed behind, standing in the middle of the empty hall. The air smelled of dust and old sweat. She remembered every fight that had brought her here, every lesson paid for in silence. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Not because she'd won, but because she'd taught without meaning to. Later that night, as she sat by her window watching the desert stars burn cold above the horizon, she thought of what Colonel Williams had said about symbols. Maybe she couldn't hide anymore. Maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe her story was never about invisibility. Maybe it was about what you do when people finally see you. She took a deep breath, the air sharp in her lungs, and whispered into the darkness. Sometimes control isn't silence, it's grace under exposure. The wind outside carried the sound of faraway drills, rhythmic, steady, alive. The bass was changing, slowly, quietly, because of her. And for the first time since those 45 seconds in the cafeteria, Sarah Martinez let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, This was what redemption looked like. What does redemption look like at 600 hours? For Sarah Martinez, it began with silence, the kind that hangs over the training hall before sunrise. Dust floated through the beam of a single overhead light. The mat smelled faintly of rubber and sweat. She stood alone in the center, her hair pulled tight, uniform crisp, heartbeat steady. Then the door opened. 4 shadows stepped in: Morrison, Jackson, Rodriguez, and Williams. They weren't swaggering this time. They walked like men arriving to face their own reflections. "Morning, ma'am," Morrison said. His voice carried no arrogance, only weight. Sarah gave a short nod. "Drop your bags, line up." They obeyed instantly. The rhythm of boots against the floor echoed like a confession. "You all want to learn something," she said. "So here's the first lesson. This isn't about fighting. It's about control. You lose control, you lose the mission. You lose the mission, people die. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am," the 4 replied in unison. "Good, then let's start with humility." She paced slowly before them, voice even, calm, the kind of calm that could command a battlefield or a whisper. Humility isn't weakness, it's awareness. The moment you assume you've already won, you've already lost. No one spoke. Morrison's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Jackson's eyes dropped to the floor. "Pair up," she ordered. Williams with Rodriguez, Morrison with Jackson. They began basic drills, defensive postures, balance recovery, neutralization sequences. Sarah moved between them, correcting, demonstrating, teaching the rhythm of reaction. Every motion she made was precise, like poetry written in muscle. When Jackson overextended a block, she stopped him with a touch to the shoulder. "You're fighting ghosts, Jackson. Don't swing at fear. Breathe, center." When Morrison braced too hard, she swept his leg from under him and caught him before he hit the mat. "Strength without flow breaks itself," she said quietly. "Again." The men worked until sweat darkened their uniforms and breath turned ragged. Yet none of them complained. Each correction was received like penance. 2 hours passed. Sarah called a halt. "Hydrate." They sat against the wall, gulping water, exhausted but alive. Sarah remained standing, watching them. Her eyes softened just slightly. Morrison finally spoke. "Ma'am, what are you really training us for? This can't be about cafeteria fights." Sarah studied him for a moment. "No, it's about awareness, situational, emotional, moral. You can win 100 battles and still lose yourself if you don't know when to stand down." Rodriguez wiped his face with a towel. "You talk like someone who's learned that the hard way." A pause, the air thickened. Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. Every lesson worth remembering costs something. The room fell silent again. Somewhere outside, a bugle called morning formation. She turned away. "Training over for today, same time tomorrow." As they filed out, Morrison hesitated at the door. "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded once. "Don't thank me, apply it." When the door shut behind them, Sarah exhaled slowly. The silence returned, heavier now. Teaching them was awakening something she had buried long ago: memory. She could still see the Afghan desert, endless dunes under white heat, a convoy in radio silence. She could still hear the voice of her former commanding officer through the static. Never react, anticipate. But she had reacted that day. She had let anger dictate motion. A village raid gone wrong. A civilian casualty that wasn't supposed to happen. Her team had survived, but the mission had not. That was the day she promised herself, never again. Back in the present, Sarah ran a hand through her hair and stared at her reflection in the mirrored wall. The eyes that looked back weren't proud. They were tired but steady. Over the following weeks, training sessions became ritual. Each dawn, the same 4 men arrived. Each day, Sarah pushed them harder, not to fight better, but to think sharper. She taught them breathing drills used in covert ops, the psychology of confrontation, the anatomy of fear. They learned to read micro-movements, to anticipate aggression, to de-escalate before striking. Some days she barely spoke. She let silence do the teaching. Gradually she saw change. The swagger disappeared. So did the nervous laughter. What replaced it was quiet confidence, not the loud kind, but the steady kind that keeps people alive. One morning, after an especially grueling session, Morrison stayed behind. He stood awkwardly, shifting his weight. "Permission to ask something, ma'am." "Go ahead." "What's it like, working alone for so long?" Sarah looked at him, surprised by the question's honesty. "Heavy," she said simply. "You start to forget the sound of trust. You rely on instinct instead of people. You stop believing anyone can understand." He nodded slowly. "Guess I can relate." "You have a team, Sergeant." "Yeah," he said, glancing toward the door where his squad had left. "But sometimes being in charge feels lonelier than being alone." Sarah almost smiled. Leadership always does. For the first time, the room felt lighter. That afternoon, she filed her next progress report. Her words were analytical, but between the lines ran something human. Observed improvement in discipline and team cohesion. The incident's initial humiliation has evolved into resilience. The soldiers demonstrate humility under instruction, an indicator of strong leadership potential. She hesitated before adding one last line. Recommendation: continue engagement. Growth in others is the truest measure of mission success. When she hit send, she leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Growth in others. Maybe that's what she'd been running from, the idea that redemption doesn't come from isolation, but from rebuilding what you once broke. That night thunder rolled across the base. She walked outside, rain striking her face, and felt the storm wash the desert dust from her skin. The next morning, a visitor awaited her in the corridor, Major Chen. "Lieutenant," Chen said, matching her stride, "Colonel Williams reviewed your latest report. She's impressed. She's also authorizing a broader training initiative. Effective immediately, you'll conduct a pilot course for select personnel, mixed unit, mixed rank." Sarah blinked. "A formal course?" "Yes, call it an applied readiness program. The colonel wants to turn your 45-second incident into a learning model." Her words, not mine. Sarah gave a quiet chuckle, the first genuine one in weeks. "That's bold." "Bold keeps people alive," Chen said. Then her tone softened. "You've done good work, Sarah. I know this started ugly, but you've turned it into something rare: accountability with purpose." Sarah nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." As Chen walked away, Sarah felt a weight lift, replaced by another kind of pressure: responsibility. The story that once endangered her cover had become her mission. The next few days were a blur of preparation. She drafted lesson plans, coordinated schedules, and designed drills that combined psychology with physical response. Word spread fast. Soldiers volunteered, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. By the time the first class assembled in the hangar, nearly 30 people stood in formation, men and women from different divisions, each curious to see what the SEAL instructor would teach. Sarah stood before them, hands behind her back. The murmurs faded. "Most of you heard stories about me," she began. "Forget them. What you'll learn here isn't about who I am, it's about who you can become when pressure closes in." She paused, letting silence anchor the words. "You'll fail," she said. "You'll get frustrated. You'll want to quit. That's the point. Because discipline isn't comfort, it's consistency when everything inside you wants to run." The training began. Within minutes, the hangar was alive with motion, bodies hitting mats, boots scraping concrete, orders echoing through the rafters. Sarah moved like a conductor among them, adjusting grips, correcting stances, forcing focus. When one recruit hesitated to face a larger opponent, she stopped the drill. "Courage isn't absence of fear," she said. "It's clarity inside it. Step in, not back." The young man obeyed and succeeded. The watching soldiers cheered. Something changed in that moment. The atmosphere, the energy, the belief that fear could be trained out through understanding, not bravado. As the class ended, Colonel Williams herself arrived, observing from the doorway. She didn't interrupt, just watched. When the session ended, she approached. "Impressive work, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "You've turned a mistake into doctrine." Sarah nodded. "With respect, ma'am, I didn't turn it, they did." The colonel smiled faintly. "Maybe, but they needed someone to show them what quiet strength looks like." They walked together toward the exit, rain tapping softly on the hangar roof. "Tell me," Williams said, "does it ever bother you what they say, the myths?" Sarah glanced sideways. "It used to. Now I realize myths only matter when you stop living the truth." Williams gave a slow nod. "Keep living it, Lieutenant. The base is better for it." As the colonel left, Sarah stood for a moment watching the soldiers disperse, their laughter blending with the rain outside. In that sound, that mix of exhaustion and hope, she heard something she hadn't heard in years: normal life continuing. Maybe this was what healing looked like, not grand gestures, but small corrections repeated until they became habit. She picked up her duffel and walked out into the rain, feeling the cool water slide down her face. The storm had passed, but its scent lingered, renewal. And as she crossed the parade ground, her boots leaving dark prints on the wet concrete, she thought of the 45 seconds that had started it all. So much could begin in so little time. She smiled to herself, a whisper only she could hear. Sometimes the fight isn't what breaks you, it's what wakes you. How long can control last before the system pushes back? Sarah Martinez stood outside the operations hangar at dawn, coffee cooling in her hand, watching soldiers arrive for training. The program she'd created, born from a cafeteria fight, had become the base's most talked about initiative. Every week, more names appeared on the volunteer list. Every week, the drills grew harder. But success has a price. It always does. At first, command loved it: higher morale, fewer disciplinary reports, measurable improvement in team coordination. But with every compliment came a new request. Could you include firearms response? Could you expand to platoon-level exercises? Could you integrate combat simulations? Sarah complied, but she felt the shift. The quiet lessons about awareness and restraint were being overshadowed by performance metrics and tactical showcases. The message she'd built, control over chaos, was being repackaged into something louder, flashier, something the military could advertise. She took a slow sip of her coffee, watching Morrison's unit begin their warm-ups. They'd changed, all four of them. No longer cocky, no longer careless. Morrison now led with patience. Jackson had become an instructor in de-escalation. Rodriguez handled logistics for the new training cycles. Even Williams, once embarrassed and bitter, had developed a calm humility that made him almost unrecognizable. They were proof that transformation was possible. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fragile was being lost, that her message was turning into spectacle. Major Chen joined her by the doorway, arms crossed, eyes scanning the formation. "Impressive turnout," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied. The colonel's pleased. Command from division headquarters has taken notice. They're requesting a briefing, possibly even a visit. Sarah's stomach tightened. A visit? Chen nodded. They're talking about scaling this into a model program. Martinez method. Their words, not mine. Sarah's jaw flexed. That's not what this was meant to be. Chen looked at her carefully. "You've inspired people, Lieutenant. You should be proud." "I didn't do it for pride," Sarah said quietly. "I did it to teach awareness, not to create another checklist." Chen's voice softened. "I know, but the military machine feeds on results, and you've delivered them." Sarah stared at the rain-dark tarmac outside. Machines forget the cost. There was no anger in her voice, only weariness. The following week, the base transformed into a stage. Visitors from command arrived in black vehicles, crisp uniforms gleaming. Colonel Williams led the reception with practiced diplomacy. Sarah hated every second of it. During the demonstration, she stood in the center of the hangar as dozens of soldiers executed precision drills, each move a reflection of what she'd taught them. The brass watched from the sidelines, murmuring approval. Cameras flashed. Applause followed. To them, it looked like discipline in motion. To her, it looked like distortion, a message stripped of meaning. When the drills ended, General Rains, a man with too many medals and too little warmth, approached her. "Excellent work, Lieutenant," he said, extending his hand. "Your methods clearly improve combat efficiency. I'd like to see this integrated across multiple bases." Sarah shook his hand out of duty, not enthusiasm. "With respect, General, my program isn't about combat efficiency. It's about prevention, emotional control under provocation." He smiled thinly. "Control leads to efficiency, same outcome." "No, sir," she said carefully, "not the same." Chen, standing nearby, shot her a warning glance, but Rains only chuckled. "Spoken like someone who's seen real chaos. I appreciate that." He walked off, leaving Sarah staring after him. She could feel the machinery grinding, her quiet teaching turning into a product, her lessons into slogans. Later that night, she sat in her quarters, staring at the after-action report on her screen. The file was full of glowing praise, outstanding leadership, exceptional tactical awareness, potential for large-scale replication. She scrolled to the end and added her own private note, a line no one else would read. "The moment understanding becomes performance, truth is lost." She saved the document and shut the laptop. The next morning, Morrison knocked on her door. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Granted." He stepped inside, cap in hand. "I heard command's planning to replicate the program. Word is, they want you transferred to headquarters." Sarah looked up. "That's so?" "Yes, ma'am. People are calling it the Martinez Protocol." He paused. "You don't look happy about it." She sighed softly. "Because it's not about the name, or the scale. It's about what happens when something born from principle turns into politics." He frowned. "You mean they'll twist it?" "They'll quantify it," she said. "Measure it, package it, sell it. They'll make it about efficiency instead of empathy." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's where you're needed to keep it honest." She looked at him, really looked. The young sergeant she'd once dismissed as reckless now spoke with conviction, balance, maturity. "You've changed, Morrison." "Because you gave me a reason to." Her eyes softened. "No, because you chose to listen." Over the next few days, the tension grew. Rumors about her transfer reached every corner of the base. Some soldiers congratulated her, others quietly dreaded her departure. The program had become a culture, a rhythm that replaced fear with focus. Colonel Williams called her in one evening. The office lights were dim, the mood heavier than usual. "Sit down, Lieutenant," the colonel said. Sarah obeyed. "You've heard the rumors." "Yes, ma'am." "They're true. Command wants you in D.C. They're assigning you to a new tactical behavior initiative. You'll brief senior leadership next week." Sarah stared at the desk. "With respect, ma'am, that's not what I came here for." Williams leaned back, studying her. "No, you came here to evaluate this base's readiness. You did that and more. But the Army doesn't stop where you'd like it to. You started something bigger than yourself." "I didn't start it," Sarah said quietly. "It started when 4 men made a bad decision and learned from it. I just refused to let it stay meaningless." Williams's expression softened. "Then don't let it become meaningless now. Take it with you. Shape it before someone else does." Sarah looked up, the conflict clear in her eyes. "I'm not a politician." "No," the colonel said. "You're a soldier, that's why they'll listen." The words landed hard. She'd spent years running from attention, from exposure. Now, her silence had made her visible again, not because she'd sought it, but because truth has a way of surfacing. That night the base was quiet. The desert wind carried the faint buzz of generators, the soft clink of flagpoles against metal. Sarah walked along the empty perimeter road, hands in her pockets, mind heavy with thought. She remembered the cafeteria, the smell of cheap coffee, the clatter of trays, the moment when everything changed. 45 seconds. That's all it took to shift her from hidden operative to accidental reformer. She thought of the 4 men who had once surrounded her, now walking beside her in discipline and respect. Of Chen, who had seen beyond reports. Of Williams, who had turned failure into purpose. She realized she wasn't just leaving a base. She was leaving a legacy, one built not on combat but on understanding. The next morning she gathered her small duffel and headed toward the airstrip. Morrison, Jackson, Rodriguez and Williams were waiting there. Morrison saluted. "Ma'am, heard you're leaving." Sarah returned the salute. "Orders are orders." Rodriguez stepped forward. "You changed this place, ma'am. You changed us." She smiled faintly. "No, you changed yourselves. I just gave you a mirror." Jackson looked at her, uncertain. "You'll come back, right?" Sarah shook her head. "People like me don't circle back. We move where we're needed." Williams, the youngest, the one who'd first reached for her shoulder, spoke quietly. "Then wherever you go, ma'am, keep teaching people like you taught us." Sarah met his gaze and saw in it the same humility she'd fought for. She nodded once, firmly. "I will." The sound of the transport aircraft built in the distance, low, rising, final. As she walked toward it, she turned back one last time. The 4 men stood in formation, silent, straight, watching her go. And for a moment she felt something rare, not pride, not sorrow, but peace. Sometimes the mission isn't a fight, it's to leave strength behind. The engines roared, dust lifted in spirals. She climbed the ramp, duffel slung over her shoulder. The door closed. Through the small window, she saw the base shrinking below her, rows of barracks, the training hangar, the parade ground glistening with morning dew. Somewhere down there, the legend of 45 seconds was still being told, but what mattered wasn't the story. It was the lesson. And as the plane pierced the clouds, Sarah thought, maybe redemption isn't about returning to who you were. Maybe it's about becoming someone who can teach what you've learned. She leaned back, eyes closing, and let the vibration of the engines drown out the noise of memory. For once, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. How do you hold on to truth when the system wants a simpler story? Sarah Martinez had asked herself that question since the day she boarded the plane. By the time she landed in Washington, D.C., the legend had already arrived before her. Headquarters was nothing like the desert base she'd left behind. It smelled of polished floors, recycled air, and politics. Every corridor looked the same, sterile, perfect, soulless. Every face seemed rehearsed. Even the walls whispered in classified tones. She signed in under her new assignment. Tactical Behavior Integration Division, a unit so new it barely existed, yet already buried under expectation. At first they treated her like a celebrity. "Lieutenant Martinez, we've heard so much. The Martinez method is groundbreaking. 45 seconds of brilliance." Brilliance, she hated that word. What had happened in that cafeteria wasn't brilliance. It was instinct, reflex, survival wrapped in discipline. Now it was a slogan. By her second day, they handed her a proposal, a thick binder, the cover read, "Project Steadfast, Behavioral Optimization Program, based on Martinez Protocol." She flipped through it. Diagrams, training schedules, marketing slides, recruitment models, words like synergy and quantifiable outcomes. Her pulse tightened. The language was clean, efficient, soulless. A colonel in a navy blue uniform stood across the table, smiling like a salesman. "Impressive, isn't it? Command wants to deploy this model across all training bases by next quarter. You'll be the face of it, of course." Sarah looked up, the face. Well, yes. You're the story of female operative, elite background turned educator. It's inspiring. She closed the binder slowly. It's misleading. The colonel's smile wavered. Excuse me. This wasn't a campaign. It was a lesson, one that doesn't fit on a recruitment poster. He adjusted his tie, tone cooling. Lieutenant, the Army thrives on symbols. We don't create legends, we manage them. And you've become one. Sarah said nothing. She'd faced armed insurgents with less arrogance. When the meeting ended, she walked out into the rain-soaked courtyard, binder still in her hand. The Capitol's skyline glimmered beyond the chain-link security fence, powerful, distant, untouchable. She felt like she was staring at a machine pretending to be a nation. Her days turned into briefings, interviews, demonstrations. Each time, they asked the same question in 100 different ways. How did you do it? How did you neutralize 4 soldiers in under a minute? They never asked why. They wanted steps, formulas, replicable drills. She gave them something else. Discipline isn't a checklist, she said in one session. It's a choice repeated under pressure. In another, awareness isn't learned through fear. It's learned through empathy, through understanding what drives aggression before it manifests. Some listened, most didn't. They scribbled notes, nodding for the sound bites. By the 3rd week, she realized what was happening. They weren't building a program. They were building a myth. One evening, she stood alone in her small D.C. quarters, lights off, the city humming outside her window. She opened the binder again and stared at the pages until the words blurred. On page 63, she found a new addition, Public Relations Integration Plan. Her name was listed next to phrases like heroic discipline, female leadership icon, modern military values. She laughed quietly, a dry, humorless sound. Icon. The word felt like a noose. Her comms device buzzed, a message from Major Chen. Heard the program's expanding. Be careful who writes your story, Sarah. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back. Too late, they already did. She deleted it before sending. The next morning, she was summoned to a secure briefing with General Rains, the same man who'd shaken her hand at the base weeks before. When she entered the room, he was standing beside a projector screen displaying slides of soldiers training under her methods. A media officer and 2 aides flanked him. Lieutenant Martinez, he said, voice booming, we're launching the first phase of Steadfast across 4 bases next month. You'll oversee the rollout. Sarah kept her expression neutral. With respect, sir, I haven't approved these adaptations. Rains raised an eyebrow. You don't need to. Your methods are solid. We've just refined the presentation, made it accessible. Accessible, she repeated, tone flat. People respond to emotion, Lieutenant. We're storytellers as much as strategists. Sarah's voice lowered. With all due respect, sir, stories can distort. What we built wasn't theater. It was transformation. If you turn that into propaganda. Rains cut her off with a wave. I know idealists like you, Martinez. You want purity, but wars aren't won by purity. They're won by persuasion. Now we can train 10,000 soldiers with your mindset, or we can let your lesson die on one forgotten base. Which sounds better to you? His logic was flawless. His morality was not. Sarah stood silent, the fluorescent light buzzing above. Then she said quietly, permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. Then I'll say this. You're building obedience, not awareness. And obedience without awareness is just another kind of blindness. The air went still. The aides shifted uneasily. Rain smiled, thin, predatory. Noted Lieutenant, dismissed. As she turned to leave, he added, and Martinez, legends don't get to choose what they mean. The door shut behind her with a metallic click. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window again, watching lightning flash over the Potomac. The reflection of the city lights shimmered on the glass, perfect, distant, sterile. Her mind drifted back to the desert base, to the cafeteria hum, the sound of trays clattering, the scent of sand after rain. She missed the raw honesty of it, a place where silence had weight, where lessons were lived, not packaged. The knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, she found Morrison standing there, rain dripping from his jacket. "Ma'am," he said, breathless, "I'm in D.C. for debriefing. Thought I'd find you." She blinked, surprised. "You shouldn't even know where I'm stationed." He smiled faintly. "Guess word travels faster than orders." She let him in. He looked around her apartment, bare walls, one duffel, one half-empty mug on the table. "Doesn't look like you've unpacked." "I don't plan to stay." He nodded slowly. "Heard what they're doing with the program." "Then you know why." "I do," he said. "That's why I came. They sent me to assist with steadfast implementation. I wanted to see you before I said yes." Sarah studied him, same scar, same posture, but the arrogance was gone. "And what are you going to say?" He looked down. "Depends on what you think, ma'am." She hesitated. The easy answer was to tell him to refuse, to walk away. But part of her knew he could do more inside the system than outside it. She stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "If you go, go as yourself, not their version of me. Teach what we built, not what they sell. They'll quote me, but you know the truth. Keep it alive." Morrison nodded slowly. "Understood." Then softer, "Ma'am, you always talk about control, but what if control means letting go?" She smiled, sad, genuine. "Then maybe that's the last lesson." He saluted. She returned it, the motion steady, heavy with unspoken respect. When he left, the door clicked shut like a heartbeat. She stood in silence for a long time. Then she whispered to the empty room, "Let it go, but don't let it fade." The next morning, she submitted her resignation. No fanfare, no speech, just a single line of text in the official system. Effective immediately, mission complete. Colonel Williams received it first. The message reached Major Chen minutes later. Neither tried to stop her. Both knew Sarah Martinez never stayed where the mission turned into theater. As she walked out of headquarters for the last time, the rain had stopped. The city shimmered in morning light, clean, sharp, reflective. She didn't look back. Her story would live on, not in the pamphlets, not in the press releases, but in the soldiers who'd understood what she really meant. Awareness before action, dignity before dominance. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter lifted off, loud, mechanical, relentless. The world kept moving, the system kept spinning, but for Sarah, time had finally stilled. She took a breath and stepped into the crowd. Just another face, another uniform, another ghost among many. And for the first time in years, she didn't mind disappearing again. Because she knew this. Sometimes the quietest exits echo the longest. Where do soldiers go when the war leaves them? For Sarah Martinez, it wasn't a place, it was a silence. Months had passed since she left Washington. She traded pressed uniforms for a worn leather jacket and the sound of orders for the rhythm of the road. She moved from city to city under different names, teaching, consulting, blending in. No medals, no ceremony, just quiet days that almost felt human again. She found work at a rehabilitation center on the outskirts of Denver, a small facility for veterans struggling with trauma. The kind of place the system forgets until the news cameras arrive. The staff called her Miss Sarah, never Lieutenant. She didn't correct them. Most days she led simple mindfulness drills, breathing, posture, situational awareness. Not tactics, not discipline, just presence. When the patients asked where she'd learned this, she'd smile and say, "Experience." That was enough. One afternoon, while guiding a small group through focused training, she noticed a young man in the back. Restless, tense, eyes darting like he was still under fire. He refused to sit. "What's your name?" she asked. "Private Lang," he muttered. "I don't belong here." "Why not?" Because I can't sit still. Feels like weakness. Sarah studied him, recognizing the posture, shoulders locked, breath shallow, pride masking fear. She'd seen hundreds like him. She'd been him once. Sometimes sitting still, she said softly, is the bravest thing you can do. He scoffed, but the edge in his jaw loosened. For a moment, she saw understanding flicker in his eyes, the first step toward control. Later, as she locked up the gym, she stood alone, hands in her pockets, watching the snow fall through the windows. Peace felt strange, like a borrowed uniform that didn't quite fit. Yet somewhere beneath that calm, something was shifting. 2 months later, an unexpected visitor arrived. Major Chen. She appeared at the center's front desk, still in uniform, still carrying the aura of someone who never stopped moving. "Sarah," she said, her voice warm but heavy, "you're hard to find." "I didn't want to be found," Sarah replied. "I figured, but this isn't a casual visit." They stepped outside into the cold, their breath turning white in the mountain air. Chen took a deep breath. "You've seen the news." Sarah shook her head. "I don't follow it." "Then you should." There was an incident at one of the new Steadfast bases. A training exercise went wrong. 2 injuries, 1 fatal. The media's calling it discipline failure. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Fatal." Chen nodded. A young recruit lost control during a live simulation. They were teaching advanced compliance drills, the same ones Rains pushed. Sarah's voice dropped. "Those weren't my drills." "I know," Chen said softly, "but they're using your name." The words hit like a punch. Command wants to distance itself. They've launched an internal review. They're asking you to consult off record. They think your input might fix the program before it unravels completely. Sarah stared out at the snow, jaw tight. They didn't listen before. They're listening now, because someone's dead. Silence hung between them. Finally, Sarah said quietly, "Send me the report." That night she read every page, the timeline, the statements, the transcript of the final moments. A recruit had been ordered to subdue without hesitation. The phrase alone chilled her. He'd panicked. His training hadn't taught him restraint, only reaction. The official analysis called it a procedural anomaly. She called it what it was, a moral failure. As she closed the file, her reflection stared back from the dark laptop screen. For months, she'd told herself she'd left that world behind. But now, the consequences of her silence had come looking for her. 2 days later, she boarded a military transport, no press, no announcement. Just another shadow moving toward a place she once called home. When she arrived at the Steadfast facility in Arizona, the atmosphere felt tense. Soldiers whispered in corridors. Instructors avoided eye contact. The air smelled of guilt. Colonel Rains wasn't there, transferred quietly after the incident. His replacement, Colonel Hartley, met her at the gate. "Lieutenant," he started. "Not lieutenant anymore," she corrected. "Just Sarah." He nodded awkwardly. "Sarah, then, we appreciate you coming." "I didn't come for appreciation," she said. "I came to see what went wrong." He led her to the training bay. The space looked familiar, mats, dummies, sparring cages. But something about the energy was off. Everything felt too loud, too sharp. Soldiers moved like machines, not people. She stopped one instructor mid-drill. "What's the purpose of this exercise?" "Speed control under aggression, ma'am," he said. "Speed without control isn't discipline," she replied. "It's danger." The instructor hesitated. The room stilled. She turned to Hartley. "This isn't training, this is conditioning." Hartley sighed. "Look, I know, but the system evolved after you left. Command demanded quantifiable aggression management." "Quantifiable," she repeated bitterly. "You can't measure restraint." He met her eyes. "That's why you're here, to remind them." For the next week, Sarah observed quietly. She walked the grounds, spoke to recruits, watched their movements. She saw patterns, overconfidence in some, quiet fear in others. They had memorized motions, but forgotten meaning. One night, she gathered the instructors in the main hall. "Everything you're doing here," she began, "is efficient, calculated, and deadly. But it's missing the one thing that keeps soldiers human: reflection. You teach them how to act, but not why. Without that, you're just producing reflexes, not readiness." A murmur spread across the room. One instructor raised his hand. "But ma'am, we're following the manual, the Martinez method." Sarah cut him off gently. "That's not my method, that's a shadow of it. Mine began with humility, not dominance." Her tone softened. 45 seconds changed my life, but it wasn't the fight that mattered. It was what happened after, the understanding that real strength is calm. You can't replicate that in a PowerPoint slide. The room fell silent. Some instructors looked away, others nodded. One woman wiped her eyes quietly. When the meeting ended, Sarah walked out into the desert night. The stars were sharp, endless, merciless. She felt the weight of everything: the myth, the misuse, the silence she'd mistaken for peace. The next morning she requested a private session with the recruits. No ranks, no observers, just raw honesty. They gathered in a circle on the training floor. "I know what you've been told," she began. "That control means dominance, that discipline means obedience, but that's not true." She looked around at the faces of young men and women who carried both pride and exhaustion. Control is awareness. It's knowing your fear and not letting it drive your hand. It's not about winning. It's about staying human in a place designed to strip that away. Someone asked quietly, "Ma'am, do you regret what you did that day?" Sarah paused. The question hung like smoke. "I regret what came after," she said. "Not the act, the silence. I let others define what it meant. And when you let others write your story, they own your soul." Her voice softened. "Don't give them your soul." The recruits listened, unmoving. For once, no one looked at a clock. When the session ended, one of them, a young woman with tired eyes, approached her. "Ma'am," she whispered, "my brother was at the base where it happened. He's alive because of your training. I just wanted you to know." Sarah nodded, throat tight. Then maybe it wasn't all lost. That evening she wrote her final report, the real one. Not for command, not for the record, for herself. The mission was never about correction. It was about clarity. Systems corrupt what they cannot measure, but the soul learns in silence. I've learned that control isn't the absence of emotion. It's the presence of purpose. She closed her notebook and watched the sunset bleed across the desert, red fatting to gold, light fatting to memory. When she stood, the sound of approaching boots made her turn. It was Colonel Hartley. "They want you to stay," he said. "Full reinstatement, permanent post." Sarah smiled faintly. "I appreciate it, but no, this isn't my place anymore." "Then where will you go?" She looked toward the horizon. "Wherever people still think strength and silence are opposites." Hartley nodded. "And if they try to use your name again?" She gave a small shrug. "Let them. I'll be too busy living the truth." They shook hands, soldier to soldier, equal to equal. As she walked away, her boots left soft imprints in the sand. Wind erased them within minutes, but somewhere beneath the shifting surface, her mark remained unseen, unforgotten. And for the first time, Sarah didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a beginning. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't return you to the fight. It returns you to yourself. What remains of a soldier when the story ends? For Sarah Martinez, it wasn't medals or headlines. It was silence, the kind that follows you when the world forgets your name but remembers your lesson. Months had passed since Arizona. She had disappeared again, this time by choice. No rank, no chain of command, just a quiet rhythm, one heartbeat, one sunrise at a time. She'd found herself near the Oregon coast, working at a small flight school that trained civilian pilots. Not military precision, not combat, Just the art of balance, machine and wind, trust and control. She never introduced herself as lieutenant anymore. To the young trainees, she was Instructor Sarah. To the locals, she was the quiet woman who always arrived early, checked the aircraft twice, and left without a word. No one knew who she'd been. And that was exactly how she liked it. On a fog-covered morning, she stood at the edge of the airstrip, clipboard in hand, watching a student prepare for solo flight. His name was Riley, 21, eager and terrified. "You ready?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "I think so." She smiled faintly. "Thinking isn't flying, feeling is. Remember your breathing, don't fight the wind, flow with it." He nodded, climbed into the small Cessna, and taxied to the runway. She watched as the plane gathered speed, lifted, and vanished into the mist. For a brief moment, her heart tightened, the old instinct, the sense of risk she could never quite unlearn. But then the radio crackled. "Instructor Sarah, I'm airborne." She closed her eyes and smiled. "Copy that, Riley, fly steady." When the plane vanished beyond the fog, she stood still, wind brushing her hair, the smell of salt and fuel in the air. Every sound reminded her of something she used to be. Every silence reminded her of what she'd become. That evening, after all the planes were secured, she sat by the coast. The horizon burned gold and violet, the ocean roaring like distant memory. She thought of Morrison, of Jackson, Rodriguez, Williams. 4 soldiers who had once surrounded her, now scattered across the world, each carrying a fragment of her lesson. Morrison had become a training officer, teaching recruits calm under pressure. Jackson was leading field medics in crisis zones. Rodriguez worked in veteran rehabilitation. Williams had left the Army altogether to start a nonprofit for mental health outreach. None of them called her anymore. They didn't need to. Their silence was the proof. They'd learned what she wanted them to, self-reliance. Sometimes growth means separation. Sarah leaned back against the rock and watched the tide pull away. "You see," she whispered to the waves, "it's all still moving even when I'm not." Weeks later, an envelope arrived at the flight school. No return address, just her name printed neatly. Inside was a folded letter. The handwriting was familiar, firm, deliberate. "Morrison." "Ma'am." They're rewriting the manuals again, stripping names, adding new ones. The Martinez Protocol is gone from the records. Officially, it never existed. But every time I train a soldier, I see you in the way they move, calm, deliberate, human. That's how I know it didn't die, just changed shape. Thought you'd want to know. Yem. She read it twice, then folded it back with care. For a moment, she let herself feel the sting, not sadness, not pride, just the strange ache of being erased correctly. Because maybe that was the point all along, to teach, then disappear. To make something last by not holding it hostage. Later that night, as wind rattled the hangar doors, the school's head mechanic, an older man named Carl, found her checking flight logs in the dim office. "You ever gonna take one of those planes for yourself?" he asked. Sarah smiled without looking up. "I fly enough in my head." Carl chuckled. "You got that look, the kind pilots get when they're remembering something dangerous." "Not dangerous," she said softly, "just defining." He leaned against the doorway. "You talk like someone who's lived a few lives." "Maybe just one," she said, "but I learned to see it twice." Carl nodded slowly, sensing the gravity behind her words. "Well, if you ever decide to share that story, people might listen." She looked up. "Some stories are meant to be lived quietly." He shrugged. "Maybe, but the world could use a little quiet." When he left, she sat for a long while, staring at the flight schedule pinned to the board. Every name was a story waiting to unfold. Every departure a promise. Every landing a small redemption. She smiled. Maybe that was enough. The next morning brought unexpected news. A journalist arrived, a woman in her 30s, sharp eyes, voice steady. Sarah Martinez, she asked. Used to be, Sarah said carefully. The journalist smiled. You probably know why I'm here. I'm writing a feature on women in military leadership. Someone mentioned your name quietly. Sarah shook her head. There's nothing to write. That part of my life is over. Maybe, the journalist said, but your influence is. The Martinez method, or whatever they call it now, is being studied as a model for emotional intelligence in defense training. I just thought you'd want a voice in how it's told. Sarah hesitated. She could feel the old instinct rising, the need to control the narrative, to protect the truth. But then she remembered Morrison's letter. The silence had done more for the story than her voice ever could. She smiled faintly. Tell them I was a teacher, she said. That's all that matters. The journalist studied her for a moment, as if searching for more. Then she nodded. Sometimes that's the best title there is. When she left, Sarah stepped outside, watching her car disappear down the coastal road. The sun broke through the fog, warm, sharp, alive. That evening she climbed into one of the small planes and took off. No co-pilot, no mission, just open sky. The horizon unfolded in layers of blue and gold. The coastline stretched below her like a moving memory. She felt the stick tremble lightly in her hand, the pulse of flight, fragile and real. Her mind wandered back to everything that had led here. The cafeteria, the misunderstanding, the 45 seconds that changed everything. She saw faces, angry, afraid, learning. She heard voices shouting, then listening. She remembered what silence had taught her, that control was never about power. It was about peace. The radio crackled softly, the voice of air traffic control. Cessna 29 Echo, do you copy? She pressed the switch. Copy tower, just taking the long way home. Roger that, winds are calm. Good, she said, glancing at the fading horizon. So am I. The sky opened wider. She flew low over the water, watching sunlight scatter across the surface like broken glass. Every reflection felt like a lifetime, flashes of who she'd been, fading into who she'd become. When she landed, the world was quiet. The hangar lights flickered softly. She shut down the engine, stepped out, and looked up at the stars. For the first time in years, she didn't feel haunted by the past. She felt anchored by it. Because in the end, every mission, every loss, every silence had pointed to the same truth, that strength doesn't roar. It breathes. She whispered to herself, the words barely audible. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't seek witnesses, the kind that says the story, over, but the meaning remains. A seagull cried in the distance, the ocean answered, the night exhaled. And somewhere across countless miles, in every soldier she'd ever taught, her lesson endured unseen, unclaimed, eternal. Because legacy isn't written in books or medals. It lives in the quiet choices no one records. She walked back toward the hangar, each step steady, sure, disappearing into the light spilling from within. The camera would fade there, a silhouette against the glow, wind tugging at her jacket, eyes fixed ahead. A soldier without rank. A woman without war. A teacher without audience. At peace. And as the screen would dim to black, the voiceover, calm, reflective, final, would whisper her truth. In the end, control isn't about winning the fight. It's about knowing when to stop fighting. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest form of strength,